hand over to Mirjana Prica. Mirjana, welcome. Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, the floor is yours, Mirjana.
All right, thank you. Let me just see, make sure technology works. Let me just, I'll share my screen and then I'll launch. Can everyone see that?
We can see it perfectly.
All right, let me just launch. All right, let me just launch. I'm not the best person on technology. Presenter view.
Presenter view, yeah.
Is it presenter view?
Yeah.
Can everyone, but then you can see my other slides. Hang on, use slide. That's it, right, perfect.
Perfect.
Excellent. All right. Well, greetings everyone from down under. I'm really delighted to be sharing our story. And thank you, Tony, for the kind invitation. But today I wear a number of hats. But the hat that I'm going to focus on today is my hat as Managing Director of an organisation called Food Innovation Australia Limited. And I'm going to share with you our story of how our clusters in our sector have actually faced a lot of disruption, unprecedented events over the last 3 years, not just COVID, and hopefully you'll walk away with a few lessons or pearls of wisdom of what you could apply in your own context. Hang on a second. So as I said, I'm going to focus on Australia, and Australia is a very big country compared to many countries around the world. And I just wanted to draw your attention. We have currently about 25 million inhabitants on our island, and our country is about 200 times smaller than the whole of Asia's population. So just to give you a bit of context in terms of size. Also, our geographical area is about nearly 8 million square kilometres, which is about a fifth of the size of the whole of Asia. So just to give you a comparison of the population density, but also in terms of the geographical area that we have to cover. And this poses a number of challenges when you are trying to get people to work together towards a common goal. So the organisation that I work for, although it's called FIAL, and although we're not a cluster, we don't call ourselves a cluster. Australia, our population is about 200 times smaller than the population in Asia, but our country is also about 5 times smaller. But we do have some challenges around, it's a large country, and we have 25 million people that are mostly concentrated on the east coast of Australia, which is that lovely part with the pointy bit on the right that you can see. Next slide, please, Tony. So although we are not called a cluster, the organisation I work for was funded through a federal government initiative called the Growth Centre Initiative. And there are 6 priority areas, and I lead the Food and Agribusiness Growth Centre. And we were set up to drive productivity and encourage collaboration across the value chain to really drive the productivity and innovation to become smarter and more export-focused sectors. So this is a great example of where government has interceded to address the market failures across 6 priority areas in our country. And it's very much a top-down approach, and it actually has delivered quite a lot of value for our sectors. Next slide, please. Everything that I'm going to talk to you and touch on today, it refers to the whole value chain from the inputs all the way through to the consumer. And everything is about value adding. It's about differentiation. We have 2 ministers. So food sits across 2 ministers. One is agriculture and one is in the industry portfolio. And the industry portfolio deals with value adding. So we have the challenge that we have 2 ministers' portfolios interfering with our sector, but we actually have a way of working around that. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a setting around our sector, and our sector plays an important role in Australia's economy. We contribute about 4% to Australia's GDP. There's been some really interesting dynamics over the last 3 years, which is what I'm going to touch on around the events that have happened. And our sector employs about 180,000 businesses across the whole country. It employs over 500,000 people, and most of those businesses are actually located on the eastern coast of Australia. In total, our sector this year has contributed about nearly 70 billion to the Australian economy. And it's quite interesting, over the last 3 years, our contribution has grown by 20% over the last 3 years. And we've had some really challenging times. So let me touch on those challenging times. Tony, can I have the next slide, please? So I'm sure you would have read about a lot of the challenges in Australia, but I just want to touch on some of the natural disasters that we've had and some unprecedented events, which has really caused havoc, particularly to food and agriculture. And to give you a bit of context, we export about 80% of what we grow and produce and manufacture. So as a country, these events have decimated our industry, but it's quite interesting. So in 2019, we had bushfires, and you would have heard, but we had 79 days of consecutive bushfires, that over 7 million hectares were destroyed or burned, and over 3 billion animals were either killed or injured. So you can imagine what sort of disturbance that caused our ecosystem. Not only that, but we've had droughts, an ongoing drought. In 2020, we had the corona pandemic, which everyone's been hit by, and we had about 10,000 deaths and over 8 million cases, which is quite interesting for a country, because what we did as a strategy, we closed the borders and wouldn't let anyone in. So we felt like a prison in Australia. So we're really delighted that our borders have opened up this year and we can travel again and also receive tourists back into our country. In 2021, we had a mice plague. And just to give you an idea, anything above 200 mice per hectare is classed as a pandemic. We've had about 1,000. So a lot of the grain crops that are being produced were destroyed by mice because of the pests. And just recently, we had another event where we had so much rain in days, in hours, that it actually had submerged complete towns and cities. And we've had astronomical damage to our country, because particularly on the eastern coast. So we've had event after event after event hitting and smashing our industry. And it's quite interesting that despite those circumstances, our sector has performed. So let me now touch on, Tony, with the next slide, what are the essential ingredients for building resilience? And I think it's really important. He highlights how we can work together in the face of adversity. So the first, if we go to the next slide, Tony, please. So the first initiative that we have done, or the first ingredient, is we've built a cluster ecosystem. And Mirjana and Patricia, and particularly Vincent, know about some of the challenges that I've faced, because my government doesn't support this. But we've managed to build an ecosystem of clusters, and I've highlighted some of the clusters that are operating in our ecosystem. These clusters have typically between 100 to about 300 members. A lot of them are very small companies, because the nature of our sector is dominated by SMEs. So over 98% of our businesses in my sector are SMEs, and SMEs who therefore do not have the economies of scale around knowledge, around connections, and then also in terms of building the relationships as well. So it's actually quite interesting that also a lot of these clusters are strategically located on the east coast of Australia. And it's not surprising when you think about it, because a lot of our production and manufacturing and growing takes place on the east coast. We have also a lot of commodity crops grown on the west coast, but you can see a lot of the value adding takes place on the east coast. And so you can imagine, when COVID hit in 2020, we had some events that just destroyed our sector. For example, the food service market, restaurant trade was just cut overnight. We had supply chain disruptions because trucks couldn't drive across the country to deliver raw materials to the east coast, or nor could we take finished product across to the west coast. People, labour was shortage. Why? Because a lot of we rely a lot on foreigners coming into our country to pick the raw crops, particularly fruit and vegetables. And as a result, there was a lot of crops waiting to be picked that were going to be ploughed into the ground. And this created an enormous challenge. But what was quite interesting during the COVID time, all the councils and governments around the country, the first people they turned to in the time of adversity was all these clusters. They were a wealth of knowledge. And why? They were a wealth of knowledge because they were connected to their communities, to their businesses, and they provided the intelligence to allow and divert this disaster. So we averted millions of kilograms of fresh produce from going into landfill to food bank, which feeds those in need. And then there were more people in need and needing to be fed at a time when COVID struck and people weren't getting employed. So it's a real challenge, but it's a great example of how we had this cluster ecosystem and it was deployed instantly because of the established relationships and connections to the local regions. Next slide, please. The second element that what we've done in terms of building our resilience is that we've provided financial support to establish the social glue. And I think Michael touched on this. It's those intangibles, that invisible thread that I believe is critical. What we observed in our ecosystem in Australia is that the federal government and a lot of other state governments, like Canada, we are a federation, so we have a national government, but then we have local governments in each state or territory. And this poses a lot of challenges when you're trying to get alignment. But one of the things that we notice about our funding model is that everyone funds a fancy bit of technology. They fund research, they fund the building of infrastructure, buildings, but no one funds human capital. And this was a real market failure in our sector. And so I through my capacity as a growth centre, as a cluster, worked out a clever way of how I could fund them and support clusters to help establish the social glue. And I can let you, and there are examples of how we have done that on our website. So I'm not going to go through it in a space of time because I'm sure I'm between you and a drink or a meal or possibly even bed. But the social glue is critical because what it does is allows you to establish relationships, form new relationships, create new connections, but more importantly, it allows you to build trust, and trust takes time. And so our funding allowed trust to build in these little ecosystems around the country, which is why when the COVID struck, we were able to deploy our services. And I just use COVID as an example, but we've had floods, we've had bushfires, and it's been amazing how these clusters have supported the local communities. Can I have the next slide, please, Tony? So an example of how social glue can really accelerate the growth of a cluster. So one of our clusters on the Sunshine Coast, and I'm only going to touch on a couple of examples throughout my presentation because I've been told I only had a short amount of time, but Food and Agribusiness Network up on the Sunshine Coast, a very nice location. If you like diving, there's a beautiful reef there that you must go and see. But the Sunshine Coast is renowned for a lot of its fresh produce. And a lot of people from around the country retire or move up there. And so what the region has is a lot of young professionals in their 40s who have actually retired, but want to give back to society. And more importantly, they want to make sure they've all moved there for a lifestyle change, but they've moved there for a lifestyle change, and they also want their children to stay there. So in order for children to stay there, they obviously need employment. So what they've done is come together to actually try to create an ecosystem that's going to be, how do they convert their raw produce, a lot of ingredients, into value-added products, and therefore provide future job opportunities for their children. So they were one of our recipients of one of our grants, which was to support the acceleration of the growth of this cluster. They started back in 2016. And what's been quite interesting, there are about 350 members. A lot of them are small to medium-sized businesses. But what's been quite interesting is an example of when you build trust, and this has taken 6 years or 5 years to 6 years of working on it. They've just now been awarded, well, actually they were awarded early this year. During COVID times, they're going to be investing in $100 million investment to build a first of its kind food and beverage innovation manufacturing precinct up on the Sunshine Coast. Now it's $100 million investment. The Commonwealth is investing, state governments investing, but as well as businesses and researchers are embedded at the heart of it. Now that investment happened during COVID, And it wouldn't have happened if the trust between those members had not been established and been worked on over a long period of time. So it's a great example of how when you do provide the investment around social glue, you actually will get great results. I'll have the next slide, please. But it's not just giving them money. What we've also found is they really do lack some certain skills that they need training. And I think Mirjana touched on this and some others. So you really need to support their growth and development. So we've done quite a bit of that. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that were really instrumental to help drive some of the growth of our clusters. When COVID hit, what we observed that a lot of people didn't understand their fiduciary duty as a director of a company, or even as employer of people. And so we had to educate people what was the impact of COVID on businesses and how you needed to counter for that in terms of your risk assessment and mitigation strategies. We also have done a lot on cluster training. If you're on a board of a cluster, everyone assumes that being on a board of a cluster is the same as being on a board of a large corporation or a small business. Let me tell you, it's quite different. And I see Patricia smiling, and so is Vincent, but it's very different. The risk profile is very different. You're behaving more like an entrepreneur, and therefore your risk appetite is very different. And sometimes if you get the wrong people on a board of a cluster, it can actually stifle the growth. So we've done a lot to educate the board directors, because we feel this is really critical to supporting the cluster managers and their growth. And we've actually run, we're going to be running another program shortly on cluster training, but it's really a great example of how you've got to really connect with your ecosystem, ensure that they get support that they need to transform and grow. Next slide, please, Tony. The last thing I want to touch on is, I think it's the magic ingredient. Everyone says collaboration, but I think, what is collaboration? And I think it's really hard to sort of say, but for me, collaboration is where people work, work and not expect to get anything back, but work towards something, to solving something so they can achieve a great outcome for many people, not just themselves. And I think that's the humility part of what clusters do. And I experienced that many years ago when I first went along to a conference. But as a great example, this is another cluster. We supported Firm Tasmania. So Firm Tasmania are based in that little island that's at the bottom of Australia. And Firm Tasmania want to become the world leaders in fermentation technology. Why? Because they have a lot of small businesses, micro businesses, and these businesses want to differentiate what they grow and produce into value-added products, because supply chain transportation costs are expensive, and they also want to raise their profile internationally, encouraging tourism into their region. So Firm Tasmania worked with the local stakeholders to connect their ecosystem, and they formed Launceston Gastronomy, and they wanted to tackle a single problem. How do they connect their community and make Northern Tasmania one of the great food regions in the world? And it's really about how do you connect people and culture to food. And, and that journey from the soil to the stomach, and it can actually touch everybody in the value chain and really create a platform for exchange across culture, creativity, and social aspects as well. And what we're really excited about is last year, Launceston was designated as a UNESCO City of Gastronomy. And this is a great outcome, an example of when you do collaborate and when you do have that trust built in that ecosystem, you get some great results. And that's a great example of another cluster that, if you support the infrastructure, the human capital, this is what can happen. Next slide, please. I'm nearly done. And finally, I hope I've given you a bit of a taste for what we do. And I say taste because I do work in the food industry, so everything revolves around food and drink. But hopefully you've had a bit of a taste. And if you want to embark on a cluster degustation menu, I encourage you to read our success stories. There was a lot of discussion around documentation. We also believe we need to sell our stories. So we've actually published a book around clusters, which was launched in 2021, I believe. I think it was last year. And 2020, apologies, it's there. And if you really want to read more about what we have done, there are some great examples of stories of innovation in this book. And The next slide is just my contact details if you'd like to find out a bit more what we do. Our website has a lot of case studies and stories, but please welcome you to connect with me anytime. And thank you so much. And it's my sincere apologies for technology. We've had a lot of floods and bad weather in Australia, and I think it's testing our IT systems.
Thank you very much, Mirjana. This was really great presentation, very insightful, and this is what you can do without the support of your government. So imagine if you had a
that's
little
why I was asking about joining the EU. That's all. Can we partner with the EU?